Good afternoon, everyone. It's Claire here, broadcasting from Newham. It looks very dark and it's been a bit rainy down here in London today, but welcome if you're joining us. I'm afraid my voice is a bit softer than it normally is. I think this is known as teacheritis. It's December, we're nearing the end of term, and obviously my voice and chest has decided that it doesn't want to speak anymore. So I'm sorry if I'll feel a bit soft to you. I hope you can hear me okay. All right, just to say welcome to Interfaith Explorers and our webinar this afternoon, which is looking at RE and interfaith conversations, particularly looking around dealing with violence and violence in religion, which seemed very timely, unfortunately, at this point in world events to pick this up, as I know it's an issue that lots of parents, as well as children, have raised with teachers, definitely where I live and in around the schools here, and I'm sure that's true for you, wherever you are, whether it's in the UK or somewhere further abroad. So just to go through a little bit of introduction in case you're new today and joining us for the first time. Of course, you're very welcome. My name is Claire Clinton and I'm the RE advisor here in Newham. I've been working here now for just over 10 years, reached my 10-year point in November. So now it's December, I'm over 10 years. And it's been great to get to know pupils and faith groups over that time, teachers, and to work in a dynamically changing part of the UK. So as I say, we're focusing on religion and interfaith conversations, dealing with those sensitive discussions. How can we do that well as teachers in Britain today? And in classrooms, I suppose wherever we are, if we're not in the UK, the principles are still the same. But it's really important that pupils feel that they can discuss these things and that they have meaningful discussions, allowing them to process their thoughts and ideas. So these webinars are put on by Interfaith Explorers, and Interfaith Explorers provides for teachers a number of free resources to help them have interfaith discussions in the classroom, and to do that well. And so if you found us today online, you'll see that there's a series of webinars that you can go back and have a look at, and that's to help support schools with CPD for teachers around difficult and sometimes sensitive areas of the curriculum. So if you haven't seen some of our others, you might want to look through and have a look at what else is on offer, as other things may be of interest to you, or other colleagues maybe at your school, or other teachers that you know who would benefit from just thinking through for half an hour some questions around some different issues. Often I'm joined by different people who bring their expertise to these discussions, and so last month we had Sarah Killu, who came from the Citizenship Foundation, and shared some of the ideas of how RE and citizenship can work together to help pupils in their learning and their thinking about themselves and about other people. But today, as you can see, I'm on my own. It's not because it's December and cold, but just because today it's probably easier on this subject just to have one person talking things through with you. So also a little bit of housekeeping. If you can see me, that's great, but you'll see below there's an option where you can open up a PowerPoint which has some notes to go along with today's presentation. I know some teachers have those printed out ready and just listen and go through those notes, whereas I know other people prefer the visual of seeing somebody, and we'll pick up the notes later. But just so you know that those are there to support you so that you don't have to write everything down that we're talking about today. Also, underneath where you can see me, you'll see there's a place where you can write questions. If you've got questions on anything I say today, or you want further clarification, then please do use that, because it's great when these are interactive and we hear back from people. So I have a beautiful assistant to my right who will capture those things off the internet for me and pass them to me. So today we said we were looking at how to sensitively discuss religious violence and terrorism in the classroom. And so today's session, we want to help you look at how you support practical discussions in the classroom with pupils. a little bit about what three religions teach on violence and terrorism, and also just understanding some of the principles that you can set up in your classroom to make it a safe place where these things can be discussed. So let's jump straight in and think about Judaism first of all. I'm going to look at Judaism, Christianity and Islam, just because many of the conflicts that are in the world at the moment have a relationship to one of those three faiths that some people will claim. Whether those people have a relationship with those faiths, many people within those faiths would probably deny. But anyway, there's a relationship, and we see that in the media. So just wanted to talk about those three first of all. So in Judaism, within their holy book, there is an idea that there can be at times something lawful about going to war with another nation or between countries. But it's really clear within their teachings that, first of all, peace has to have been sought. So it can't be that you just go straight to war or to violence or to terrorism, but that you have to try and find a peaceful solution. And the word shalom is a very important word within Judaism. And it's not just about peace in itself, but a peaceful land, about a land where people can grow and be at their best and where everything does its best. So that's about nutrition in people's lives, not just in crops, but everything blooms and grows and is positive. And so though Judaism accepts certain types of wars can be ethically justified, it's sometimes morally right to kill in certain circumstances. But before any of that, there has to have been a good amount of trying to resolve and make peace, and obviously not go to that point. It's a final point to go to. So Jewish law permits combatants to be deliberately killed in a war, but innocent civilians must be given every opportunity to leave and get out of the way. And that's, you'll see, is echoed within Christian writings and beliefs, and also within Muslim scriptures and beliefs. This idea that civilians shouldn't be caught up in something, that you know, if a country's at war, there are people who do that within the country, who have been trained, I suppose, for that. And it's really important that civilians are kept safe. Now, I say this because I think this is quite helpful for us as teachers to get an understanding between military and civilians. And when children are talking to us about maybe it's somebody who's blown themselves up and killed civilians, and that person is linked to a religion, that whether that person feels they're part of a religion, that religion's teaching makes it very clear that harm or hurt to civilians is something that is paramount, that should never happen. It's not unforgivable, because there may be situations where something happens where that wasn't the intention. But if somebody's intention is to harm civilians, then that is seen as not morally justifiable and religiously not justifiable. And I think that gets us into the territory of these discussions within sort of terrorism and terrorist attacks, as to who is military and who is a civilian. And many terrorist groups will talk about everybody in that country being part of the military, because if you allow a country to go to war, then you are culpable, that you're responsible. And in history, going back all the way over the last 2,000 years, you will find individuals who justify that injuring of civilian life to the fact that the whole country is at war. And they don't take that part of their teachings about civilians and about those in the army sort of literally in any way. They sort of really don't see the civilian part of it. So though I'm talking about Judaism here, the same will be true for Christianity and for Islam, and then into sort of other religions as well. So in much of the Old Testament, the Jewish Torah, the writings, the scriptures, it's clear that God gives his approval to war. There are times where the Israelites are fighting to gain a land so that they have a land of their own, and it's a promise that God has given them. And often he is seen as somebody who will protect them against their enemies. But throughout the Jewish scriptures, you'll also find this longing for peace that's always there, that in passages that often are quoted around Armistice Day and sort of all our sort of peace thinking at times of remembering the war dead, there's quite a few references in those services that come from Jewish scriptures, whether that's Isaiah or Micah, Habakkuk, where it talks about peace being in the land and swords being used as farm equipment, and animals like a lion and a lamb being able to lie down together, that violence is something, when God's presence is really with his people, there will not be violence. And so though violence may be justified to stop evil within a religion, ultimately no religion sees violence as a state of how God would intend the world to be. Or if you're looking into the afterlife is always a place where there is no violence, there is no killing, there is no sadness, there is no death. All of these things have gone. And so the aim of a perfect human life, in a sense, is without all of those things. And so we see that longing and that basis for that in scriptures. So, yeah, I suppose that deals with Judaism and Jewish thoughts. So within school, you may find you have children from particular parts of the world, and if there are children who come from sort of Arab world, then sometimes there's that relationship between Israel and Palestine and the conflict there. And so there needs to be some understanding of the Jewish faith and what it teaches, and that how a state might be different from the teachings of a religion. Not every person in Israel is going to follow everything that's written in scriptures, and that would be the same of countries that are Christian or are Muslim or are Jewish, that you can't always hold those up as paragons of showing how this faith's teaching is lived out in every area. Okay, so just moving on to that third PowerPoint on Judaism, just talking a little bit about what rabbis have taught over years on war and whether it is morally justifiable or not. And you'll see that there are three cases given. There are obligatory wars where God commanded Jews to fight, and you find those in Jewish scriptures. I referred to them earlier. Defensive wars, where if Jews were being attacked, that they're obliged to defend themselves. And optional wars, maybe these are taken for a good reason, and there's no other form of negotiation remaining available. And I suppose it's when you get to those optional wars that you get different ideas within Judaism as to whether some Jews would agree with them and some Jews wouldn't agree with them, because actually they would look at that process of peacemaking. And for some, if they feel that's being taken seriously, then there may be an optional war there. For others, they would want to see more peacemaking attempts happening before they get to that point. And so, as with all people, there's going to be these different levels of understanding and interpretation of what those scriptures are meaning in a practical situation. So, moving on to Christianity, And I suppose Christians had a long tradition for the first sort of 300 years of Christianity of being pacifists and often being persecuted for their pacifism, that they wouldn't join up and be part of the Roman army, and often when they became Christians and were in the Roman army, lost their lives because they refused to take someone else's life. And that all springs really from teachings of Jesus, and that Jesus himself was pacifist in all his dealings with different people, that he didn't use violence even when things were unfairly done to him, that he found other ways of objecting and then actually accepting bad treatment at times. And so that was really the thing that Christians followed in those first few years. Then when one of the emperors himself became a Christian, there then began a bit of teaching about maybe there are times where war can be justified and where violence can be justified for good reasons, and really following on those Jewish ideas that sometimes there may be wars for defensive reasons where they have to stand up and be counted as such. And so there has been this sort of different teaching in the church. But today, I would say there's quite an agreement around a just war theory. Many students get taught this when they're doing GCSE RE, and it looks at sort of 3 or 5 main reasons that have to be sort of ticked off in order for a war to be justified. So there's steps, there's processes, there's things that need to have happened before a Christian could get involved in a conflict. So the theory is not there to justify war, but to help Christians living in troubled places and at troubled times to think through whether it is ever right to defend others, maybe who are defenceless. This I suppose has influenced particularly our country over the last 200-300 years in the wars that we've been involved with, like the First World War, the Second World War, and thinking through whether that ever can be a right thing to do. And there were many Christians in the history of our country, that's the UK, who even decided in those circumstances that it wouldn't be right to take the life of another person. And that goes back to the golden principle that we often call it in education, about treating others the way you'd want to be treated. And if you do not want to be killed, the principle would then be that you would never kill somebody else. And I think all people would agree that that's the way that life should be lived, but it's always looking in these precise situations. So within Christianity, unfortunately in America last year, there was a case where Christians killed a doctor who allegedly and at some times had performed abortions. And they felt because the doctor was killing an unborn child, it was justified for them to blow up this particular doctor and end his life. So you can find groups within any religion who will take things to an extreme, who will take a teaching maybe out of context, or maybe will not look at other contexts to a particular line from their scriptures. And so justification of things from scriptures is interesting, because sometimes people do look at wider contexts and sometimes people don't. And I suppose our job as educators is to help children understand what these texts teach, i.e. that principle of loving others is the most important principle, and that sort of not using violence is an important principle for Christians. And so that's something that they don't really want to do. And there are certain situations where the church teaches it might be okay to, but there are heavy checks around those. And that's important because that's tooling children up with information and knowledge, and that helps them in their thinking through of when they hear somebody who's justifying what they've done, maybe through their faith or through their religion. The children can think back to actually what they've found out that the Bible teaches, or the Jewish scriptures teaches, or maybe the Quran teaches, and they can begin to evaluate and apply that knowledge in those situations. Okay, so moving on to Islam. Most Muslim scholars believe that killing civilians is forbidden in the Quran, that's very clear. And they often will quote sayings from the Prophet Muhammad, where sort of enemies, women and children need to be carefully removed from situations, and so that we don't ever injure civilians. So do you remember that idea that I mentioned in Judaism coming up here as well? So Islam also bans suicide, and within Islam, most Muslims believe it's about tolerance and peace and freedom from oppression. And so when you have people who will call themselves Muslim, but then would take away civilian life, or would blow themselves up as a means to hurting civilians, most Muslims that I know, and most Muslims within this country, would say that that is not something Islamic. And they'd probably want to question, those people may call themselves Muslim, but are they actually Muslim? Because are they living by the words of the Quran? So there are also in the Quran sort of passages which talk about fighting and winning sort of land and ground for Islam and Muhammad, and this all goes back to Medina and Mecca and battles 1,500 years ago between those places. And so what you've got happening in the same way as in Judaism, that interpretation of God saying there's a land for you. So what does that mean now? 5,000 years later or more. And again, within Islam, what do those passages that talk about Mecca, Medina, and battles there, what does that mean today for us here in the UK or in the Western world? How do we apply those things? How do we interpret them? And so that's why it's always interesting to find out with particular teachings from particular imams' mosques, where scholarship goes back to, and who their ideas are coming from. And I find that quite helpful for me to understand then that flow of understanding, how the Quran is being interpreted, and what one group might do with that as opposed to another, and whether that can legitimately be done or not. So I think, as we have seen on television and within newscasts and in newspapers, most Muslim people find sort of terrorism abhorrent, and that would be no matter who was the terrorist. It's not something they feel their religion is teaching them, nor asking them to do. Now, there's an interesting blog, and we'll maybe put a link, talk about putting a link into the PowerPoint slide, of a teacher and an educationalist called Matt Coward, who wrote a blog a little while ago about the prevent duty and thinking about education. And I just wanted to read a little bit of what he says on it, because I think it's really helpful in thinking about our role as teachers in amongst handling this religion and violence and terrorism. So he's quoting here Christine Blower from the NUT and Russell Hobby from the NAHT, National Association of Head Teachers. And he said the role of the teacher they maintain should be first and foremost to safeguard and educate the children and young people in their care. Okay, so the DFE's prevent duty asserts that pupils' resilience to radicalisation can be built by promoting fundamental British values and enabling them to challenge extreme views. Resilience is not the problem here. It is the nature of education that is needed to build resilience. And so what we're saying is the reason why it's important to discuss these things with children is because actually their need for resilience to be built through education is really important. If that is not built up over time, being able to handle difficult issues and think through sensitive and controversial issues, actually they will not have resilience to be able to deal with those as adults well, or in the way that we as a British society would like to see. So what he said is that although the building of these skills is fundamental, as are the needs for resilience, determination, self-esteem and confidence, and the ability to engage in healthy debate and weigh evidence, such as skills are not possible with the prerequisite knowledge with which to debate. So how far we expect young people to be able to challenge extreme views if they're not provided with the understanding of religious traditions which will enable them to recognise when a view is extreme or not. And this is why I'm just talking through these three religions with you, because young people need to know what these religions teach so that they are able then to challenge and think through when they find someone else calling themselves something, whether that person can be, because how are they living by those important teachings. So he talks about one can and should instill British values of mutual respect, but at the same time people should be made aware that these values are not uniquely British, and they also run through many of the world's religions, including Islam. The word Islam means submission to Allah, and yet to Muslims it also has another meaning, derived from Arabic word salam, which means peace. And that's often a greeting that Muslims give to one another, asking for peace be with you, peace be on you. And so for us, we don't exist as human beings outside of our cultural or our social time or location. No one is totally unaccommodated as such. On the contrary, we're embedded in our cultural tradition, in a period of history, in a system of power relationships. And so all of us are engaged in sort of the unending tasks and struggles to accommodate and adjust to others. So how we talk and how we text in the media also help us to understand and how we live with difference and perception and value systems. And so we can't remove who we are, and we can't remove the values that we have been brought up with, that we understand, and also that we've decided to own. But it is important that we don't get into pointing the finger, but we try to understand the views of others, even when they're different from us, but also that we have that critical knowledge base that we can also challenge from. So one of the things that Matt says in his blog is the importance of maintaining active connections with local faith communities. And this is one of the things that we've said a few times on Interfaith Explorers, that we really think it's important for you as teachers to do, is to look to engage with and to build up via your parents and via your local community relationships with people outside, and particularly faith communities, because what this does is it will end up with a rounder curriculum, but also helps young people to become resilient and confident citizens in this global world that we live in. And it's important that education is there to empower young people. And the part of the prevent duty, the sentence that I like, and that's also in the Ofsted handbook, is about helping young people to become positive contributors to modern life in Britain. And again, everything we're doing as teachers flows from that. We want children to be spiritually, morally, socially, culturally developed, intellectually developed, so that they can make those positive contributions into our society, which is a diverse society and does have many different cultures running within it. But as in a tapestry, that can be richer for understanding, tolerance, and mutual respect. Anyway, let's go on to the other little bits on the PowerPoint, which was some principles that I've just put down about discussing violence in the classroom. One of the things we did after the Paris and the Beirut attacks was to share Pip Wilson's blob tree picture that she created around how different feelings that might be going on in Paris. And you'll see that on the PowerPoint there, that might be a very useful thing to share with children. Though obviously it was done for Paris, you could use it in different times, in different situations where there has been a violent attack, and that you've got a range of different people there experiencing different emotions, and to help children think about who relates to them, how they're feeling, and also to see that all those other feelings might be going on in the same room. Again, we're building up their emotional literacy, but we're also bringing up within this their religious literacy, their ability to talk about why those people did what they did, whether they feel that's a valid way to act or not, and if not, why it's not. So in handling these situations in the classroom, we've just given you sort of some principles that will just help with handling this. So ensuring that your pupils know ground rules for discussions, that they're using ownership language and exploring issues and facts around it. That you as the teacher need to affirm contributions and allow for a range of answers. Children will often learn well to criticise and critique one another, and it's about you creating that atmosphere where they can do that, so that balanced views are given, and actually to be able to raise views where you think, well, were they justified to do what they did? That is okay for children to do, because some children do their thinking out loud, as we know. Some children process in their head and then give us an answer. For those children who need to think out loud, the position that they end a discussion in is often very different from where they ask the initial question, or their position that they've decided at the start. And it's important to model that can happen, that's okay to happen. That's part of the process. We're going to think through this together, and we're going to keep on thinking through these things. Be honest with pupils without being ruthless. It's important that we respect who they are and treat them in the way that we would want to be treated, but also that we are challenging, that we don't let them get away with just saying anything, especially when things are maybe not factually correct, or maybe they're making assumptions, or maybe they're making generalizations. That all of these things can be challenged in an open and a caring way, which allows pupils then to be able to reflect and to think about what they want to do in these situations. Now, we've done some previous webinars on interfaith explorers, looking at interfaith discussions, thinking about critical thinking, how you can build that up with your students. So if you're interested in a bit more detail about that, one of those I did with a friend of mine called Marie Hardy, and she was talking about how she has interfaith discussions in her classroom. You might be interested to go back and have a look at that. So, wrapping up now, things that we've done today. So we've thought about what 3 religions teach about violence and extremism, so that we've got some grounding in those religions ourselves, and therefore that will help us to know questions to ask and challenges to give pupils in their discussions. Also, there's a number of resources on Interfaith Explorers that you might find helpful. So there are films and videos of different people talking, as well as some activities from the Lemon activity. If you haven't tried it, it's a good one to start interfaith discussions with, and also some advice on dealing with difficult issues and running questions and inquiries with respect, and another one on making choices. All of those really useful sheets for you as a teacher to help you in your professional development. Finally, I find it quite useful at the time of anything coming up in the news, looking to Newsround and looking to some of the reports and films that they make around it. Partly in a primary school setting, I find that helpful because they're doing the news there for sort of 7 to 11-year-olds. And so it often pitches an issue at the right level for the pupils that I'm talking to. In terms of secondary, then I often use different news reports, which again you can get online, BBC or ITV. But particularly with primary, I find Newsround a useful resource because it will give me a way into discussing whether we're talking about the Paris attacks or the Beirut attacks or somewhere else in the world where something happens and the pupils are upset by this, and they're upset because of the loss of life and the indiscriminate nature. And I think that can be a fearful thing. So they need to talk it through and think about how they're choosing to make, how to live their life, but also, sorry, my throat's gone, how to live with other people who are maybe different from them. I'm being passed water, which is very kind. Thank you. I'm having a sip. Right, okay, we nearly got through without me coughing. That was quite good. Okay, I also know that some schools begun to change the language of what they talk about in school, so that when children, for instance, talk about ISIS or Islamic State, they're changing that to Daesh, so that we get away from using Islamic in context with this particular group. As I say, many imams and Muslim people that I've spoken to do not feel that these people at all could possibly, because of their choices and how they choose to live their lives and not following Quranic teaching for them. So I think that's interesting as well, and something we need to be mindful of as teachers, that we need to watch our language, and we don't want to fall into stereotyping, and we don't want to fall into finger pointing in that sense, but find a way of being able to talk about these things that helps children think about them properly. Okay, well, we're going to see if we've got any questions. I'm going to have a bit more water. Oh dear, this is not good, is it, for you? You don't want to hear me coughing on a Thursday afternoon. Right, have we got any questions about today, about handling? I'm looking to the side. Well, there's some writing going on, so there may be a question. Okay, we'll wait a moment and see what comes my way. Is it a question I can answer? Is always my thinking at this point. But anyway, thank you. All right, so how do you deal with children's bullying of others around being a terrorist? Yeah, I think this has come up in a number of schools actually, where sort of Asian Muslim children have had a backlash maybe from other pupils, particularly where those pupils may be in a minority within a school. I think it's really important, therefore, this teaching of what the Muslim religion teaches about civilians, about suicide, about peace, because actually if we educate those other people to say, you know, some Muslims don't think, though these people are calling themselves Muslims, they can be Muslim, because look, they're not following what the Quran says, and allowing children to make those connections. And often parents at home will not have enough knowledge about these religions to be able to give those as facts to their children. So us doing it in schools is really important. I also think there's quite a few things that you can do. You can talk to children to say if they have or experience any negative bullying around their faith, around their identity. Always come and let you know, and that's actually, you're going to do something as a school to make sure that ceases and that stops. And I think it often comes from a place of ignorance. It's not coming because children have got a thought out rationale around these things. It's often a reaction and it's to do with other children's pain or worry or fear or anger at things that they've seen done in the world that they don't feel is right. That's also what Matt in his blog was talking about, the reason why it's really important that children visit these different places, like places of worship. So I was doing training recently with some imams here in Newham, and they were saying, Claire, it's even more important that children come and visit the mosque at the moment. Who's going to smile and be happy to see them and place and be kind to them. And actually children need those experiences, because otherwise other voices might get the highest attention. And so I think there is there for us to make sure stereotypes not being allowed to live as such or to rule the day. So what about instances, finally, where children have been referred to the channel process, which is part of the radicalisation, trying to stop that. Yeah, I think within a school, that channel process, the school is going to be part of those discussions and part of how's the way forward with these pupils. And so if you have a pupil that in that circumstance, it's really important that people in the school know what's going forward and where things are going. And I think where that's happened in schools, there are usually regular updates where that's appropriate. And I suppose it's knowing who's in charge and knowing who is working that story through with those individuals, because the whole point of that process is to help them in the choices they're making and to maybe challenge some of the assumptions that they have swallowed or believed, which are not true. And sometimes that process involves mixing with a different number of people. I remember one case where a young sort of white British boy, aged about 14, had got involved with a right-wing group, and part of that channel process for him was actually going to a youth group where there were people from other cultures, because actually, though he was in a school with a mix of cultures, he didn't have friends from different cultures, didn't have friends who from different races, didn't have friends from different faith backgrounds. And one of the things that he talked about was so helpful for him was that ability to see the world bigger and to understand that people are people and not just seeing people in stereotypes. And that came from the experience of meeting people outside of school in another context where he could get to know people in a safe place. And actually that radically changed his view on certain groups that he had got involved with, who had a certain view towards other groups. And so in all these things like Channel are there to try and help to give that wider experience and to bring people together who've got different expertises to think about a child holistically. So I think if a child's involved in that, it's knowing who you go to in the school if you have concerns or you want to check something through. But there will be somebody involved in that journey with that young person, looking to, as I say, challenge and help them through some new learning. Okay, well, thank you for being with us today. This is our last one now before Christmas. Our next one is in January, and I hope you have a good rest from school. I hope that you have a healthy break, and that I will see you in the new year, and hopefully I'll have a new and better voice at that point. Okay, thanks very much, and see you again soon. Bye.